All right, so on to our topic for today. Susan Lindsay is a member of the Oakland County Quilt Guild, and she is also a volunteer here at the Troy Historic Village. And she lives in a beautiful Civil War era house that I got to see yesterday. It's so cool. And it was moving to that house that kind of got her into quilting. You know, she has these bedrooms that she needs to furnish. You can't just go to Bed Bath & Beyond and buy an 1860s bedspread. So she took up quilting, and now everything looks curious. It's very, very cool. So please help me welcome Susan Lindsay.
Thanks. Hello. I've been quilting for about 30 years. We've been in our house for 24, and I started just before that, just because I'm a sewer, and I've been sewing since I was in 7th grade when we had home ec class. And you know, when you sew, you got scraps, and what are you going to do with them but throw them out? So let's make some quilts with them. And I think I know the first quilt I made was a wonderful little 12 by 12 square quilt because my son wanted a dinosaur quilt. And we couldn't find them. There just was no dinosaur quilts around, even in the Penny's catalog or anything. And so I found the fabric, and I made him just, you know, a squared quilt for his bed. 6 months later, it was in the Penny's catalog, so I should have copyrighted it. So that's what got me started. And then once we moved into the house, like we said, I just couldn't put a regular bedspread on the quilt, on the thing. So slowly but surely, of the 4 kids, starting with the oldest, I made quilts for them and tried to keep them somewhat old looking, but also something that they would want. So I'm going to try to keep the talk mostly with Civil War, but I will get into a little bit more of the history of quilting. So anyways, just before the Civil War, like more of the 1800s, there was a lot of technology advancements, and it really changed sewing and American scene and everything like that from a more of a rural agricultural society to more of a comfort where they had more leisurely time. So by the time the Civil War came around, the sewing machine was invented in 1846. By the 1860s, a lot of people did have sewing machines. So then they weren't doing as much by hand. The sewing machine became a little bit more affordable. Instead of spending 14 hours a day making a shirt, it only took them an hour. Now, I have tried to make a shirt in an hour. I don't know how they did it, but I thought, really? I'm going to have to try that. Because I have made historic shirts, too, that they would have made. But I could see, I mean, I can't imagine, because this one quilt I am making entirely by hand, and it's been a 10, 15-year project. So I can't imagine them making all these clothes, especially stuff like this. I mean, they're not short seams by hand, so I'm sure they were just like, oh, a sewing machine, and all you have to do is crank it, and it does all these stitches. This is great. And then it would be more regular and more sturdy, probably, too, than the hand sewing, although I'm sure they were very good at what they did. The actual sewing machine was first invented by Elijah Hauer, but Singer made it more popular and more affordable for everybody. He was able to bring the price down to $50 for a home machine and $125 for a commercial. So by the time 1870 came around, he had sold, in the year of 1870, he sold 600,000 machines that year. So that's how it became, and then the other thing that he did was he invented an installment plan, which they still do sell sewing machines on installment plans. I bought most of mine that way. But he had the installment plan. It would be $5 down, $3 a month for 18 months. Which, oh, doesn't that sound awful? You know, but for them, $3 a month was a lot of money. You know, so some people still didn't have the sewing machine, but a lot of them did. It became much more popular just before the Civil War. And so, believe it or not, there was still machine quilting done, which I was really surprised. I can't imagine doing it on those little machines that they had. But most of the time, most of the actual quilting in the quilt was done by hand, but it was usually put together by machine if they had that, had the machine. The batting was really, really thin. Most of the time their batting was carded, unlike today's batting. So they would card, like up here, they probably mostly card wool, especially during the Civil War because cotton wasn't available to us. And then they would lay it in between the layers on the quilt. That is one of the reasons why all the quilting was so close. Because if you just did that and then washed it, it would bat up in between the stitches. And so generally their stitching was like about 1 inch apart, unlike today's quilts that we could do almost 10 inches apart. Today's batting is more needle punched, and so it's not going to bunch up in between the quilt. And so mainly the South would be using cotton, and we'd be using wool because of the embargo that they had against one another during the war. They also, surprisingly, which surprised me in my research, they would do some of the applique quilts by machine, which I always thought was always done by hand. I think it's cheating when you do it by machine. But they did it back then, and I thought that was pretty surprising. And then I don't have it because it's in a frame, but one of the most popular things they did by machine around the applique was echo quilting, which means it just kind of echoed the design. So if you had like a snow leaf design, it would slowly but surely every 1/4 inch echo that design going out through to the end of the square. And it takes a long time, so I could see why they would do it by machine. I started my Hawaii quilt 6 years ago, and it's still in the frame. But it's really, it's a neat look, and I could see with them, especially if their stitches had to be so close together to keep the batting from bunching up when they washed it, that it would be a really nice look for them. The other things that were invented during this era was the safety pin was invented in 1849, and the zigzag stitch was invented in 1873. So a lot of really cool things I could see as a sewer. They would be so excited about, let's try this out, let's try that out, and be able to do it a lot faster than they were by hand. Also in the early 1800s, the printing of the fabric before was done by block printing, so it took them a lot longer to print fabric. So obviously if it took them longer, then it was going to be more expensive. But by around 1820 or 30, they finally came up with a cylinder, a roller cylinder that would print the fabric. And so it reduced the printing time from 15 hours to 2 minutes. So obviously fabric went way down in price. They were able to do 4 colors with the cylinder. So it really made fabric so much more available, so much more cheaper for them. And on top of it, that's when our industry age started, because in the textile industry, it ended up employing 1.5 million people by 1835, especially on the East Coast, because that's where most of the mills were. Indigo blue was a very popular color. It was something similar to this, because the indigo plant was really permanent. And so most of the dyes back then were plant dyes, and lots of times would wash out. The first mineral dye or chemical dye was this cheddar. And even the woman at home was able to do it. She was able to go to the drugstore and pick up that color and dye her fabric. And obviously it was very brilliant compared to some of the other colors they had, so they always tried to stick it in a quilt somewhere. The only problem of it is that the dye was mainly toxic and had lead in it. Which back then they didn't really know and didn't think of the problem with it. A lot of the reds back then turned to brown, and so lots of times if you see a quilt with brown in it, it may have been red at the beginning, and then it just slowly, the dye just kind of turns, especially if it's in the sunlight, it'll turn to a brown. Also, quilts between 1860 and 1880 were not limited to cottons. I think we nowadays have a tendency to use cottons because they're just so much more easier to use. But back then they would always, they would sometimes use their old dresses and stuff like that. And so silks, brocades, wools, especially up here, were used a lot. In fact, almost more than cottons were at first. And then the nice thing about those fabrics was that they absorbed the colors a lot more. So the colors are more brilliant and more true to like a red or whatever color they wanted. So they had a tendency to use those a lot. I find them hard to use. I'd much rather use cotton because they have a tendency to move, and silk. The nice thing about wool, though, is it doesn't fray as much, and so sometimes you could just use it without turning under the edges. One of the patterns during the 1840s, I happen to have one that I made with Civil War fabric. It was a signature quilt. And they used this a lot when people would leave the area, like if they moved out west and stuff like that. And they would have the ladies sign their name with permanent ink. And then sometimes they would even ask them for a piece of their dress and have them put it in the block, or they would put it in the block. And that was their way of remembering people because, I mean, let's face it, if you go to Oregon, you're not going to come back to Michigan very often. In fact, most of the time not. And so this was some way of them treasuring their friends out east. And another name for those, and there's lots of names for all these blocks. They lots of times would rename them. Another name for those is called Beggar Blocks, which means they were begging fabric from the ladies. Another quilt that was popular at the time was the Baltimore elbow quilt, and it started out, and this is mine that I made as a block of the month. It started out, I loved this one because every single block was a different technique. And so I learned stuff every month from it. It was so cool. Kind of turn it around. To actually make the top, probably a couple years. And then to quilt it another year. Generally, I'd take about a year to quilt my quilts. But that was made popular by, obviously, ladies from Baltimore. They were called the Ladies of Baltimore. And what they did was they would make these quilts and sell them for worthy causes, which is very often done up here, even before the war. It seemed like the North did this more than the South. And so they would make these and sell them for a worthy cause, and the money would go to the charity. And that's where it became popular. And as a result, since the quilts were being sold and scattered around, and people started copying the patterns, and it became a very popular pattern. Before the Civil War, fabric was 8 cents a yard. Oh, wouldn't that be a dream? During the war, because of the northern embargo, and the fact that we had the mills and they had the cotton, lots of times the South would ship their cotton to England to get it processed because we wouldn't do it. They had a couple mills down in the South, but most of the time they were targets, and so they would very easily get destroyed. Then they couldn't repair them because they didn't have the machinery to repair them. Because we very much worked together. I mean, they could grow stuff, and we couldn't grow it as long. We can't grow cotton up here. And we had the mills because we had people, we were able to build the machines and everything up here. So when that got cut off, things started falling apart. And so as a result, fabric got very scarce. and very expensive. And believe it or not, it went up to $25 a yard. Now, in today's mind, this is, that's expensive for me. I can't imagine, something going from 8 cents a yard to $25 a yard. That's amazing. So as a result, they obviously did a lot of redoing of dresses. The South would lots of times take apart mattresses and use them. They would take the fiber out of the mattress and spin it and make it into cloth. I mean, they did anything they could with what they were able to get a hold of. Let's see, and even the thread was hard to get because that still is a spun cloth, cotton or whatever it is. And so even if they redid their own thread, they couldn't always get it through the needle because it wasn't as fine as it is through the factories. And most of our thread at that point came from England anyways. A lot of our thread still comes from over in Europe and Germany and stuff like that. It's just something I guess we just never picked up. Another popular thing that came back during the Civil War time was the whole cloth quilt. And they also called it white work. And if you want, sure. I'm not fussy about gloves, I'm okay. These are washable quilts.
We'll hold it together.
Okay. I mean, this is huge, so you don't really have to pull it all out. This one was took me a year to do. But I just wanted to be able to say I did this. And it's all hand quilted. I actually had it in a frame, and we had to take it off because one of our neighbors needed a kidney transplant, and so we put another quilt in the frame and had a quilting bee and auctioned off that quilt, and then I put this quilt back in. So it took me a little bit over a year to do, but it was fun.
Was your Baltimore quilt hand quilted, machine quilted, or a combination?
Hand.
Hand quilted?
Yeah, yeah.
What period was the white work?
It started out in the 1700s, and then it came back around the Civil War time or a little bit before that. Mainly because a lot of the people that were going to out west, they would sometimes do a quilt on the way. And then also their homes were smaller. And so for some reason or another, this was easier to fit in a frame in their homes as compared to the big homes out east. And so it revived itself again back in the mid-1800s.
Did the original idea of quilting come from Europe?
Where
did it start?
Well, it would have been Europe because the Indians didn't do it, but
where, I should say.
I'm not sure exactly where. I know a while ago I researched it for when we were demonstrating at the museum, and what I had understood, at least from one of the places I found it, that the women first started quilting for the men who had armor on, and they would put it underneath their armor so that way the metal wasn't next to their chest. So that was one of the first places it was used. And then, of course, we don't leave things alone. We got to keep going with them and get more creative with them. I mean, even when the scarce were supplies, and when the supplies were scarce, they figured a way of doing stuff. So it's just, especially up here because it's cold, and when you didn't have a furnace, I mean, lots of times the estates were like, when they did the inventory of the estates, they had 14, 15 quilts. It just, and even now I don't like heating my house so much that we always have a couple quilts on our bed to keep us warm. But a story about the whole cloth quilt was this one lady had a stage stop in which some of the soldiers were laying out there in the middle of a battle, and they were getting cold because it was nighttime. And so she lent him some of her quilts. And when they returned them, unfortunately, one of them, the soldiers, got typhoid. And typhoid got in the quilt, and it killed both her and her husband. Because back then they didn't know about the germs. And then a lot of the soldiers ended up dying more from disease than battle anyways. A lot of them were farm boys. They weren't used to being around people, you know, that close in that close quarters. There was a lot of unsanitary conditions, and so there was more people, more of the guys more died of disease than they did of the gun battles. So this was just one way, you know, it ended up getting spread because they didn't know about the germs and how, and I'm sure even today's quilts, there's a lot of germs in them. It's just that, it's fabric, it's got batting in the middle, it's gonna house some germs in it, but at least we know what to do about it. They didn't. One of my prized projects that aren't done yet is this one right here. And this is what we call, all of us quilters call a Dear Jane quilt.
Wow.
All the blocks are 4 inches, very tiny pieces. The first one I tried to put together by machine, and the pieces ended up in the machine. And I says, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. And so I ended up doing every single one of these by hand. I literally copied the patterns, the books on that stack, but I literally, oh no, it isn't, it's here. I literally copied the patterns from the book and then cut them out and traced them on the fabric and then stitched them together. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years. Jane Stickle finished the quilt in 3 years. I don't know how she did it. It has 5,602 pieces, 225 patterns. I'm not actually on the last row, and now I got to do the border. I'll put the book out there, but that's what the quilt's going to look like at the end. So it just because it was 1863 and I live in an 1850 or 1840 house, I thought, well, this is perfect, right? I didn't know I was getting myself into. But it's okay. It's something that I do that. I like almost form a kit with that, and then I take it on the road with me and I hand sew it as we're driving. And so it's just fine with me. It keeps me busy. But she was born in 1817. She got married somewhere around 1850. All they were going was by the census. And so in 1850 she was married. So she got married a little bit before then. In the 1860 census, for some reason or other, she was living by herself and her husband was living with her brother-in-law. They don't know, you know, again, just by the census, they don't really know what was going on there. In 1870, she was living again with him on the farm. In 1877, they were forced into bankruptcy. And in 1883, her husband died. So the time that she made this, she was living alone. They had, as far as they could tell, no kids. There was 3 kids that they assumed responsibility for according to the school records. But they weren't theirs. They were somebody that they were taking care of. After bankruptcy, they ended up being boarders on a farm, and that's where she was when she died. The quilt actually is at the Bennington Museum in Vermont. I would have loved to have seen it, and we actually drove by the museum. And my husband even says, "You sure you don't want to stop?" But I just couldn't right then. My mom was sick, and I talked to her on the phone. We didn't know what was wrong with her. And I knew there was something wrong, and she wouldn't tell me. And so I just had to get home. Otherwise, I would have loved to have seen the quilt. And it actually is now 150 years old, and it is hanging in the museum until October 14th. And it turned out my mom had ALS, and so. she died soon after that, so it was glad I got home, but it would have been nice, but that's okay. The other thing that quilting did at this time, and you can imagine the women, all the men left for war. The women were stuck on the farm, taking care of the kids, taking care of the farm, taking care of all the household stuff. And then on top of all that, they were worried about whether their husbands were ever going to make it home or their sons were ever going to make it home. And so I know with me, and I'm sure it was with them too, that it relieved a lot of stress. Now I know a lot of people look at all the detail on that and think you've got to be nuts. But it does for me. My husband even thinks I'm nuts. I mean, there's always a quilting frame in my front room. But after even, because I'm an accountant, so after a long day of listening to a bunch of clients and doing tax returns and telling people bad news or telling people good news or listening, whatever, 9 o'clock at night, I'm just in heaven to sit there at that quilt frame and sit there and quilt for at least an hour. It just makes me feel good. And I'm sure it did with them too. I mean, the sewing was so much more a part of their life because they had to sew. They had to sew their clothes and everything like that. And so it was such a stress reliever to sit down and quilt. And lots of times they would get together, or they would have quilting bees. They called them quilting frolics back then, not bees. That's a new term. But they would have quilting bees and get together and talk. And I'm sure it made them feel a lot better even just doing that. And then it would be a social thing too. I mean, they would have food and maybe even a dance afterwards or something like that. So it was, you know, I'm sure it relieved a lot of their stress at that time. They would also get together to do a bunch of soldier socks, tents, blankets, shirts, uniforms, anything that the soldiers needed. One of the quilt things that they needed was almost like a bedroll for them. And in fact, the Sanitary Commission requested that it be 7 foot by 4 foot. So that way it would fit on top of a cot. They would be able to roll it up and put it on their back when they were marching. And so they often would get together and try to create as many of these quilts as they possibly could. Because even in the South, it gets cold at night. You know, so no matter where they were, I mean, I'm sure, especially if they weren't feeling well, a quilt would make them feel a lot better. They didn't really know about germs, but a lot of times they figured out that if a quilt went from one soldier to the other, that the other soldier would get sick. And so after a while, they started learning to boil and burn a lot of this stuff. Also, a lot of the quilts got buried with the soldiers that were killed. So there isn't a lot of those quilts left at all. They're more of quite a find if you could ever find them at all. They would also get together and have what they call sanitary fairs. And this was done through the U.S. Sanitary Commission. And they made, and of course, since it was a U.S. commission, they kept records. They made 250,000 quilts for these guys, which is like, wow. And this was mainly the North. This was not the South. In the South, it took them a little bit longer. They were used to having the slaves do all their sewing. And so they would, they eventually stepped up and did more of the quilting and making of the socks. One of the things they did was they would make quilts, and they call them gunboat quilts. And they would auction them off, and they would take the money and use it to buy the gunboats. And they ended up doing enough to buy 3 boats. So that was, you know, pretty good considering they weren't used to it. They did a lot of homespun fabric too. And like I said, they tore the mattresses apart, and they actually used carpets for blankets because that's what was available to them once the fabric was gone. Some of the other people that would help would be the school children. And there was one story that the school children got together as a class and made a quilt. And they requested that, that it go to a soldier that liked kids. and the soldier had the white back. It had the right back. And they end up writing back. Now, I don't know whatever happened to the soldier. They don't really know. But I thought that was pretty cool. The kids got together and did it, too. The quilts, obviously, just to be patriotic, were often made of red, white, and blue. But they were also made out of regiment colors, too. So each regiment had their own color. And so lots of times, in order to honor the regiment of the area, they would make a quilt for them. Or make the quilts for the guys out of those colors.
Were the Sanitary Commission quilts made mainly for hospital use, or what were they?
No, it was to keep the soldiers warm, too.
Okay.
So they would be something they would give the soldiers along with, socks and uniforms and stuff like that. But the ladies were the ones making them. Some of the quilt blocks were renamed. There was one in the South that was called Seven Sisters. It was 7 stars. I don't have an example of it, but it was in honor of the 7 states that were first to succeed the Union. And so they would often, their blocks were in memory of stuff that was going on in the Civil War, like the Richmond Beauty, the Dixie Rose, the Cotton Ball, Union Star, Lincoln's Log Home, and Boulegards Surrounded, stuff like that. And they would sometimes take existing blocks and rename them because it made them look like that, look like what they wanted to. Or sometimes they would create them too. Nowadays, or at least especially in the early 1900s, even nowadays too, a lot of the blocks are named by magazines. But back then they were named by what was going on at the time. Another technique that the South did in order to make the fabric stretch longer is they would take a whole cloth and then they would take printed fabric and they would cut out the flowers and then put it on the whole cloth. And that way it looked like a pretty quilt, but yet the printed fabric would go farther, because that was obviously harder to get a hold of than the solid fabric. Because I'm sure they could just weave the solid fabric, but the printed one was harder to get a hold of. And so that was something that they would do. And it would require some really good sewing skills to get those little fine prints on the fabric. They often didn't use batting in the South either, because they just didn't need the warmth. They would just have the 2 cloths. Sometimes in between, on both sides, north and south, they would put paper in between their fabric, in between their quilts. It's still insulated. They didn't have the batting, so they would put paper, newspaper or whatever they could get a hold of. Feathers from birds and stuff like that. Because the batting became very scarce, and it was probably, especially the wool, was being used for uniforms and stuff like that too. So it was a little bit, they were resourceful, very resourceful. One of the things that's kind of controversial, and everybody is not really sure because nothing was written down, is the Underground Railroad. It's probably started around 1830 and ended at 1865 when slavery became illegal. So there's really not a lot of written history. A lot of the blacks were uneducated. A lot of the slaves were uneducated, and so it wasn't really not worth to write it down anyways. But one of the ways that the slaves would remember the blocks would be making a sampler. And so they would make a sampler quilt. Of all the different squares that they were supposed to be able to see along the way or what they meant. Some of the ones that they had, and I'm just going to put this sheet down here and you could look at it later because it's really small, were these blocks. And like the monkey wrench, which was this one, I don't know if you could see it, meant to gather the tools for the journey. The next one, the wagon wheel, meant to pack everything. And so these would be kind of hanging out on the line. And then once they saw that quilt, and sometimes it would be, and it wouldn't be unusual to have a quilt hanging out on the line to air it out. So the masters never thought anything of it at first. And so once they were hanging out on the quilt on the line for a couple days, they realized this is the time to pack. A carpenter's wheel usually meant to steal away to the west or the northwest. Bear's paw meant that you should follow the widest path along the mountains because it was most traveled and it was easier to follow. Because a lot of the paths went around the mountains rather than over them, and they went to the crossroads, which was Cleveland, Ohio. That was the spot they wanted to get to first. And that's another block, is the crossroads. The log cabin, most log cabins, I think it's varied, but most log cabins have red squares in the middle. If it had a brown or a black square, it meant the house was safe, and it was safe to go in, where most of them would have made it as red. There was a block called the shoe fly, and they're really not sure. They still don't know what that meant. And they're thinking it might meant an actual person that helped the slaves, but they weren't really sure on that one. Again, things were not written down, so it's hard to tell. The bow ties, blocks, someone would bring the slaves clothes and help them, because lots of times their clothes either were tattered to begin with or they were tattered on the way. And so if they brought them some new clothes, they would blend into society and they wouldn't stick out as bad. The flying geese, which is real similar to this one, this pattern right here, meant to go north just like the geese would. And so sometimes they would tell you, and the geese would go in the spring, and so that would be the best time for them to travel. The drunkard's path, that's what this one is right here. It meant to move in a staggered fashion so that you would elude the people that were hunting you. So just don't take a straight line, start moving around so they can't find you. North Star was to follow the North Star. Tumbling blocks. Unfortunately, all the tumbling blocks I've ever made, I've always given out as baby quilts, so I don't have one. Means to box up your belongings to escape, or it's time to escape. And then Jacob's Ladder, again, was another safe house. Another thing they would do sometimes in the quilts would literally have the actual quilting stitches would be the path to follow. Nobody would ever think anything of it because it was a quilting stitch in the quilts. Some of the other examples I have, the one actual antique quilt I have that I actually purchased is this one. And we pretty well have dated this to the late 1800s, early 1900s, but I think it's more the late 1800s. And mainly it's because of this polka dotted fabric here. But they also used a lot of pinks, and a couple of these were patched. So some of this has modern fabric in it, and I would love to pull it off, but I'm just going to leave it alone. But I thought this was in really nice shape. I haven't really touched it at all. I thought it was pretty neat looking. Late 1800s, early 1900s, but I think it's closer to the late 1800s. This quilt mainly I brought because it's all Civil War fabric. It's something I just made for my husband because he loves the Civil War. And so I got a bunch of reproduction Civil War fabric and just put a quilt together for him really quick. I love the colors. They're gorgeous. So, and you're welcome to come up here and touch and feel. I'm fine with that. We don't need white gloves. This quilt is just an example of the Mariner's Compass, which I just love because it's more Michigan. It's not really antique fabric or anything, but what I do when I travel is buy fat quarters from a bunch of quilt stores, and then I make a quilt saying this is my Michigan quilt, or this is my...
Can you show us the back?
Yeah. That's unique.
This was a great find. I think it was up in Ludington. So I just felt Mariner's Compass was very appropriate for Michigan. And it was a quilt pattern from the 1700s. So it is an older quilt pattern. It's just not made of that kind of fabric. I just mainly brought this one to show you that they did a lot of stars. And then this is the log cabin, but this is not, yeah. They did a lot of stars mainly for patriotic reasons. But the log cabin was very much a, and this one I think is from the Grand Canyon, Arizona. So that's why you got all these kind of fabrics there. This quilt is another one of my block of the months, and I just brought it mainly because it was, looks like more old fabric. But it was mainly, like January's snowflakes, February's, Valentine's, and that was the idea of that one. Yeah. This is antique fabric. It's not done. It's one of my UFOs, and one of these days it'll get done. But again, a lot of stars. And it's more for patriotic reasons.
Where do you buy your antique fabric?
Online. Quilting Friends used to have a lot of it, but they're closed now. In fact, this material was bought from Quilting Friends. Sue bought some of John's grandma's, and then I think this one she said she bought, but that's his grandma's. And like I said, that cheddar is really important back then. That was one of their biggest, brightest colors they had. And then this is, again, another one of my block of the months, and it was about a story of, and each month came with like a chapter to a story, which I thought was so cool. And it was about a lady going across to Oregon, and some of the things that she encountered, like the flowers and indigo and stuff like that. So I thought that was pretty neat.
So will you pass these down to family members?
Hopefully my girls won't fight over them.
Better put their name on it.
There's a couple of my quilts that I told them they better not. I'll come back and haunt them. I'm hoping they don't throw them out in the trash. I don't think they would. But yeah, I got 3 girls and a boy. And the boy's married too. So, and now I got 1 granddaughter and 2 grandsons. So hopefully, yeah, I'm always making them. That's just one of my releases.
It's a wonderful thing to hand down, though, something that was done by your hands.
And every one of the grandkids that were born, I made them a quilt. And every time the kids got married, I made them. Now, admittedly, they weren't always on time. I just finally handed my daughter her quilt. She was married 2.5 years ago. But she chose one, and I would love to have brought it, but I just finally gave it back to her. She picked one of the most difficult patterns. And the squares were, I think, more this size. I don't know. I think they were more like 5-inch squares. And they had curved seams. And then she told me when I got halfway through the quilt that her bed was a king size. Oh, yeah. And so it was like,
I love the old white one. I mean, for a bridal gift or something. It's gorgeous.
And I've seen people give them for baby quilts. Which is a smaller quilt, and so it would be more doable. Because like I said, that took me a year. That's a lot of quilting in there.
It's stunning. I love that.
Thank you. And the one saving grace for us quilters is that the rotary cutter was invented in 1979. My first quilt I made without it, and I mean, it's a matter of just like this, you're tracing templates or something like that, and that just takes forever. And honestly, the one quilt that I just made for my daughter was templates because they were curved, and so you just really can't do it with the rotary cutter. The roll of fabric is mainly, in fact, that's all fat quarter Civil War fabric. So it gives you a really good example of what kind of fabric was back then. This one stack of books right here is a lady, and those are her historic ones, but she's written about 17 now, I think, books. And it's like about quilters, but yet it isn't. It's a really good, she's a very good writer. But those are the books that happen to be about around the Civil War time. But her first book was all about a lady who lost her only sibling and went back to the family mansion and was going to clean it out and sell it because she had no use for it and she had no heirs, and neither did her sister. And they finally ended up turning this mansion into a quilt retreat. And that's where it started, but the next book had to do with her family history. And then, like I said, these are basically all her relatives throughout the years. It's all fictional, but it's neat. Yeah. I can't pronounce her last name, but her first name's Jennifer. Thank you. But she's a good writer. Her next book is supposed to be released on October 1st. I already got an order.
The famous scene in Gone with the Wind when Scarlett refashioned the dress.
Oh, yeah.
The drapery was actually based in truth.
Oh, yes.
Rework the fabrics. Yeah.
Yes. Even with the tassels, you know. That cracked me up.
Oh, Carol Burnett. Oh, yeah. With the,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, she's a card. I love her. But the nice thing about Jennifer, she also has some quilt books, and that's the newest one out that goes with the book. And so, admittedly, she wrote Union Quilters a long time ago, but now she's got the quilt that she was talking about and tells you how to make it. So I can't wait to get at that. I may even use that Civil War fabric for that. This one right here.
Could you tell us about crazy quilts? When do they come in? Do people
That was more Victorian.
Victorian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was more Victorian, and they often would use a lot. I actually have one at home that I made.
Mostly made out of fancier material.
Yeah, it was more velvets, silks.
They're very haphazard. There's no rhyme or reason to it, just pieces here and there.
They were mainly showing off their stitching skills, you know, because they would often add the embroidered stitches on top of it. So it was more adding, you know, their fancy skills, because they, again, as time went on in the 1800s, we had more and more leisure time. I don't know what happened to it because we don't have it anymore, it seems like. But yeah, we have more leisure time, and so they found things to do, and that was, you know.
I'm noticing that there's a lot of paisley patterns in the Civil War prints, and I didn't realize that paisley was American. I always associated it with British or European or something.
But a lot of the patterns came from there, you know. But yeah, paisley was really, really big in the Civil War.
Paisley?
Yes, very big. It was probably because of the new printing process and everything like that. It was a lot more easier for them to do than the block printing. Yeah.
There's a question over here.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, how many quilts would you estimate you've made over the years?
Over 30 years? I don't know. Because I give so much of them away.
Okay.
I mean, I got 2 right now in the car that I'm going to be giving to my niece and nephew because they just both had kids.
Hundreds, thousands?
Oh, no, not thousands, I'm sure. Because they take, you know, again, I'm such a diehard at hand quilting. A lot of the baby quilts I will machine quilt. And I actually, for my grandson, made him a really cool quilt that looked like a puzzle because he's so into puzzles. And so the actual block looked like the puzzle interlockings. And so he was, that I did on machine, because I'm too cheap to give it to the long arm quilters. So I made it on the machine, and it was so heavy as a twin size. So generally, I would much rather hand quilt them. But I did do that one because I knew I wanted to get it done fast.
Well, do you take a picture of each one that you do?
Yes.
And record it?
Yes.
So and who you gave it to, so that
Yeah.
there's a history.
I do, but I've never put them in a book. I got to go through all my pictures and do that. That's one of my projects. I'm gonna do one of these days. But I've been really good about keeping family photos up in a book, but the quilts, I gotta go through and pull them. But yeah, I do. I make sure I'm a diehard at taking pictures.
It's hard if you put all that work in to give it away. Do you put your name on them in a photo?
Yes, my husband makes me. He makes me. I started out as a embroiderer and then went into kind of cross stitch, and then I got into this, and I haven't left it yet. But yeah, I says, oh, I don't need to put my name and stuff on there. And he's like, yes, you do. And so, yeah, I mean, for a while there, I just bought these labels and then wrote on them, but now I got an embroidery machine, so I embroider. So, yeah, and I guess I'm kind of glad I did, because now I look back and I don't know what year I made that quilt, and now I know, you know, by looking at the label. Yeah. Well, I mean, even that quilt, I have not a clue who made it. And when it was, all I could do is go by the fabric. You know, and it could, you know, it could be earlier, well, it can't be earlier than that, but it could be later, because sometimes people pull stuff out of their scrap bags. But it looks like it's pretty old. I mean, I know it's pretty old. I'm pretty sure it's close to 100 years old at least. So.
Is it possible to put a value to quilts?
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, whoever's going to pay whatever for them. But yeah, there's antique, there are people out there that will praise antique quilts, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you speak to the flour sacks?
Yeah, but that was a little later. I mean, it may have started a little bit in the Civil War.
What did she ask?
The flour sacks.
Oh, flowers.
Yeah.
Feed sacks.
Feed sacks. I'm sure that, I know that the calico ones were a little later, and that because the feed sack distributors caught on to the fact that they were using the fabric. And so then they made pretty prints so that you buy more. I thought that was, but I don't know. I thought it was more during the Depression. Am I, okay.
Nothing to do with the quilts, but is this an authentic Union hat and belt, or what's the story here?
That my husband is Mr. Civil War man, to the point where when he was a kid, he dressed up as a Civil War soldier for Halloween. He's also got his history degree, bachelor's history degree. So I knew what I was getting into. I didn't know I was going to end up in an old house, but that's okay. I mean, his first comment when he saw our house was, oh, it was around when Abraham Lincoln was. Oh, this is cool. But anyways, that's just really his reenactment stuff. His reenactment, part of his uniform.
Oh, okay.
But he's been doing it for a long time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. He's part of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil Wars. And... Huh? Where do I live? I live in Troy. Yeah. I live near South Boulevard in Rochester. But the house is not on the main street. We are lucky. It was built 700 feet from South Boulevard, and now we got a subdivision between us and South Boulevard. So, and we're on not quite an acre of land, but it's a really cool house. It's very special. Sons of the. I always call it the Sons of the Civil War, but there's something else in there. Union. Sons of the Union Soldiers of the Civil War, something like that. It's SU. Is there any other questions, or? Yeah.
You mentioned that one dye that was great.
Cheddar? Yeah.
The yellow.
Yeah, this one right here?
And it's called Shutter.
Cheddar. Just like the cheese. Yeah.
And it was one of the first.
It was one of the first chemical mineral dyes.
So was it actually based in lead, or did it have just lead in it?
They said it was primarily, there was a lot of lead in it.
Okay. So
But
it
it
was
wa-
actually made out of lead? I mean, as far as the mineral that was used?
It must have been if there was a lot of lead in it. Before that, most of the dyes were plant dyes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and then as a result, they wash out a lot more easier than the, I mean, indigo was one of the best ones because it held it, but purples often turn to browns and reds turn to browns, and so that's why a lot of the quilts look brown.
I know they used henna a lot too, but henna,
Yeah.
it out, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I found a small quilt up in an antique store up north. It's not an antique, but the blocks, I think it was done like either by a group in a church to raise money because each block was done by a different woman.
Yeah.
And she's embroidered her name. I think it was done like either in the late 1970s or early 1980s. So it's about 30 years old.
It was probably a fundraising quilt.
Yeah. Is that what they call them? Okay. Yeah. It's really,
Yeah, and the ladies
it's
got
all-
together and,
Yeah, it's all houses, and some of them are very primitive and basic. I mean, and some of them are really fancy with a lot of, apple cane cutout things.
yeah. Oh, yeah, somebody wanted to outdo the other guy.
The other person.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was part of a smaller quilt group, and we did that. We all said we were going to make houses. We gave each other the pattern, and some people put fences on them, some people put more buttons in it. And,
One has a little
yeah.
cat in the window, I mean,
Yeah.
things like that, small
Yeah.
added things,
And then what we did was we each made, like there was 8 of us, so we each made 8 blocks, and we changed them around.
Oh, okay.
So that could have been the thing too, but generally if it was from a church, it was probably a
Yeah, and I
fundraising.
don't know it was from a church, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
it's a group of women, and like I said, they each, signed and dated their square,
Yeah,
and then put them together. And I collect like things that are houses or house shaped. So I mean, when I saw that quilt, I thought I knew I wanted to have it. And the owner of the store had to call down to Florida to see if the owner of the quilt would sell it for what I was, offering to buy it for.
well, that's neat.
Got it, yeah.
That's a special and a special find.
It's special,
Yeah,
quilt.
quilts are fun. They're fun. I love them. Any other questions or yeah?
Is there something that you would find a difference between the Amish quilt and the Civil War quilt, or is there a history behind the Amish quilt?
Generally, the Amish quilts are solid color, solid fabric. They usually aren't in the calico family, but they will make them that way. It's just that generally, if you see a solid color quilt, it's going to be an Amish one, or I honestly really don't know any other, the Amish ones do have a tendency to be a little more plainer too, but they can be fancy. Yeah.
Colors are characteristic of the state they come from. There's
Oh,
Pennsylvania
yeah?
colors, there's Ohio colors, and so on, depending upon what was available.
Probably their church district, yeah.
Got to do with the climate and the dyes that they used, and
Yeah, because each church district has its own little rules. It's not an overall faith where everybody follows the same rules. They make what's good for that area. Okay.
Where do you get the fabric to do Civil War ones? I mean, how do you get the old stuff, the old print?
There's a lot of quilt shops that will specialize in old fabric. Generally, as I'm traveling, I'll pick it up, or I'll go online if I'm looking for something in particular. Quilt and Friends used to have a lot of historic fabric. That's where I got this fabric. But in the area, maybe the one in Berkeley might have it. I'm not sure. No? Okay. I haven't been there in a while, so. But like I got that online.
I've heard of one in Brighton.
Brighton?
I don't know the name of the shop.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's just, every quilt shop has its own personality, and that's why I love visiting them. As we're traveling, I mean, we'll just purposely go out of our way to certain, GPSs are wonderful. Because otherwise you couldn't find some of these because they're usually in smaller towns and stuff like that. Yeah.
Sounds like a really stupid question.
No, never.
You're saying the old fabric, is it actually fabric that was made way back then? Or is it fabric that like within the last 5 years, but is printed with a pattern that was popular back then because.
No, they have, most of the mills have records of what was printed what year. And that's where they get these reproduction fabrics. That's why they're calling. Yes. Oh yeah, no, they're not the old, no, they wouldn't have been, no. No, they would have rotted along. Unless they take old dresses that happen to be around, that long, but I doubt it. No, these are all, the mills have record of what was printed on certain years. I mean, it's a business. And so they kept the records. And in fact, that one book I have, Dating Fabrics, that's where that's kind of from those. And then they just pick certain ones and reprint them. And
Are they more money than when you?
Oh yeah. Oh. But most quilt shop fabric is.
Say that again?
Most quilt shop fabric is more because it's more threads per inch, and obviously they don't make as much of it like Joann Fabrics does. Okay. And so generally quilt shop fabric is definitely over $10 a yard. You very rarely see it pay lower than that. I've seen it as much as maybe $15 a yard. Yeah. But if you only buy a quarter yard, who cares? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.